Good morning. We call the meeting to order for the Audit Committee for April the 11th, 2019 at 9 a.m. in the Belchase Council Chambers. Let the record reflect that Mr. Duke is here and the machine is open for roll call. All members are present. Mr. Duke is here representing the Audit Department, and we have Mr. Jason here representing the paper, Gazette, infamous. All right, Mr. Duke, we'll wait till the Secretary gets back, and then we'll go forward with the Pledge of Allegiance. I guess we can go ahead and say the pledge. Please rise and we'll say the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, welcome to the meeting. We'll begin with item number 2.
New business, A, discussion of the follow-up internal audit of the Port employees' expenses and Visa credit expense.
At this time, we'll turn it over to Mr. Duke.
Okay, what we're going to do this morning is take a review of my follow-up audit of the Port's credit card expenses and employee expenses. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. My audit report, if you would, Ms. Kim. Yes, thank you. Okay, I'd like to go through with the new committee members some of the areas such as objective, scope, and methodology that I normally use in every audit, but this audit as well. The internal audit standard 2500.A1 states that the chief audit executive must establish follow-up process to monitor and ensure that management actions concerning the internal auditor's recommendations have been implemented, or that senior management takes the responsibility and the risk of not implementing the auditor's recommendations. The objective was to determine the status of the internal audit recommendations as stated in the credit card and employee expense report dated July 10th, 2018. The scope of the audit was recommendations stated in the Port's credit card and employee expenses of the same date, July 10th, 2018. My methodology consisted of a review of the documentation submitted by the Port's comptroller to determine compliance with internal audit standard 2500.A1. What I'd like to do now, for the benefit of the committee, is to take a look at the internal audit report and the conditions. Take a look at the internal audit report's conditions. Finding number 1 was the credit card expenses for the Port, questionable expenses. The condition was that I reviewed a population and selected January of 2015, April 2016, December 2017 expenses, credit card expenses, and supporting documentation to review. During this review, I noted personal expenses with no receipts, interest charges for January 2015. The Port did note the amounts for these personal expenses on their credit card documentation. It did appear that the Port was transparent, and that's it for that procedure. However, the employees could be liable for interest charges for using credit cards for personal and unallowable expenses. In addition, the Port was not in compliance with the Louisiana State Constitution, Article 7. if we take a look at my recommendation, business credit cards should never be used for personal expenses. Employees should pay for personal expenses from their own funds. All monthly credit card expenses should be supported by itemized detailed receipt or another form of appropriate sufficient documentation showing that these expenses were accurate and valid. And my recommendation was business credit cards should never be used for personal expenses. Employees should pay for these personal expenses from their own funds. The credit card expense statement should be properly supported. And the response, the status of the response, or the status of my recommendations being put in place. The Port has updated its accounting policies to reflect the internal auditor's recommendations. Policy updates were supplied to the Port Board. The resolution for updates and revisions was introduced on July 26, 2018. The Port Board agreed not to adopt the changes until the completion of the Port's contract and agreements internal audit. The resolution dropped from the agenda due to referral. The resolution was reintroduced on January 24, 2019. The updates and revisions included adjustments to rates in the alignment with state and federal rate for travel allowances. Revisions also included the requirement that the Port supply the chairman with unallowable charges on a quarterly basis to determine if disciplinary action is needed. Finding number 2. Credit card expenses lack of business purpose. During my review of the Port's January 2015, 16, and 17 documentation, I noted a lack of clear written business purpose and explanation written on the receipt and supporting documentation. It appears that the Port's control over these expenses, which they have written in their policies, was not operating effectively. My recommendation was all Visa credit card expenses should have a clear written business purpose explanation written on the receipt and other supporting documentation describing the Port's business. Describing the Port business that took place, discussions, dates, names of persons attending, company in relationship to the Port. The status of my recommendation, the Port has implemented a business purpose log requirement for all credit card transactions, reimbursements, and unallowable expenses. Each transaction is coded with a specific business purpose. Credit card expenses for special meals. During the review of these, I noted that the Port sends a quarterly report to the Port's committee chairman for review and approval. It was noted the chairman is reviewing these expenses but not signing or approving the Port's quarterly and special meal report and any attached supporting documentation, indicating that the special meal expenses and supporting documents were reviewed and approved and in compliance with the Port's policies as well as the state of Louisiana policies. My recommendation was the chairman should review, sign, and approve the quarterly special meal reports that are sent to him or her, and any attached supporting documentation indicating that the special meal expenses and supporting documents have been thoroughly reviewed and are in compliance with Port policy and the state of Louisiana travel and meal guidelines. The status is the Port will continue to send these special meal reports to the chairman for review. Credit card expenses lack of approval. The condition during my review, I noted that several credit card statements did not have check marks indicating that the expenses had been reviewed. It was noted that on December 2017, the Visa credit card statement itself had been approved. Recommendation, make sure all credit card statements, expenses, and supporting documentation should clearly show approval indicating that the credit card expenses were reviewed by the port, as well as the supporting documentation for accuracy and validity. Their response, the port's response, is they're going to continue to submit these statements and with appropriate approval for review and approval. Observation number 1, the port's employee expense reimbursements. The condition was from the review of 47 employee expense reimbursement forms and supporting documentation. It was noted that the employee expense reimbursement forms were being used to pay back the port for credit card expenses and employee expenses without sufficient documentation, such as for expenses with no supporting receipts. In addition, it was noted that one expense report did not have a supervisor approval for $27, and 4 expenses were without sufficient supporting documentation, $1,270.63. My recommendation with the port's accounting process, as stated above, should be revised. The employee reimbursement form should only be used for employee advances and valid business expense reimbursements. The employee reimbursement expense supporting documentation should include the attached expense form, supporting dollar amounts, supporting documentation, and be reimbursed before reimbursement is made to the employee. Status of my recommendation is the port has revised its reimbursement procedures to only include reimbursable expenses. Unallowable expenses have been removed from this report and are reported on a single and separate report, which I believe is now being sent to the chairman. Okay, that concludes the credit card review. Follow-up audit.
Have been implemented, or
Yes,
at least are in the works of being implementing, and I believe we have the policy on the agenda for today, and it's been deferred several times for adoption, which will include some of these recommendations.
Yes, sir.
And corrections of actions being taken by the Port Administration.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any questions from any of the members? Ms. Newberry?
Was that a one-time, or was that several times that they used the credit card for personal?
Several times.
That's what I thought. And in the beginning, I thought you had said at January 2015.
Well, that was a whole month of review.
Oh, okay. So let me ask you, so they still continue to have a credit card for the port plus?
Yes, they do.
So you recommending, how are you separating the port credit card and personal?
Well, the documentation they sent me on their credit card statements are not having any type of notation that they had during the audit that personal expenses were flowing through the Visa statements.
And they are cooperating now with giving the proper receipts that are needed to match the charges?
Yes, they are. Yes, ma'am. My original, and I think I can show you this, but I'll just mention to you my original conclusion was for the port to stop using credit cards completely. Okay, that was the end result of this audit. I wanted them to do that, but they decided not to accept that recommendation.
And I understand that, as long as the receipts match the charges.
Mm-hmm. And they do. However, you know, the fact that they were noting personal expenses on the credit card statement, you know, is something that is an alert. Now, the documentation reviewed for this follow-up audit does not show those personal expenses. So, I have to leave it at that.
Anyone else?
Those findings was just 3 months out of the year.
Yes, sir, that's correct. We could have easily gone back a lot more months, but normally these audits, when they show 3 months of, I felt like my objective was to note the finding, that it was happening. I mean, I could have gone back 3 years and made the amounts a lot more, but I'm not sure how much of a difference that would have made, unless we were in some sort of lawsuit or something, or unless there was fraud involved. I could have said, gone back 3 years and said, oh yeah, we have $5,000 rather than $1,000. I didn't really see the need for that. I felt the need was just to point out they are doing this, let's get it fixed.
Let's go back to the chair. You mentioned something about the chairman approving the receipts.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that something they've been doing in the past, or is it something?
Yes, that's something that was, they've been sending quarterly reports for special meals to the chairman for, several years. And those have to be reviewed by the chairman. They have to sign off on them. Or we have the committee or the council has to say, we don't think that's our job. We don't send them to us anymore. If that's what the council wants to make as a policy. I do think that it's a good thing to send those reports to an independent entity, an independent person to review them, such as a chairman. I think that's a good idea. Now, but it's up to the council whether they want to accept that board policy or not.
What are you calling a special meal?
Special meal is when they go out to, on a trip maybe to different places, and they have group gatherings, and the executive director is giving a presentation, and they pay for the meal from, big meal from the hotel.
Because I don't know how it works in government. In the real world, I can't buy my boss a meal.
Right.
Just happened to me the other day.
Yeah, well, the Louisiana State travel expenses does allow special meals.
Can they buy us a meal?
No, I don't think that would be a good idea. Now, if you all are going on a trip with them and they have a legitimate, committee or something going on where they're talking about business and you're part of that group, I think it would be okay then. But, I really don't think that if I was a council person and I was even invited to a trip of that nature, I'd probably pay for my own meal.
All right.
That's just me. But there's no rule against that. I did look up the Louisiana rules on special meals, and basically the board has copied that verbatim into their policies.
So back to the sample that you used. You used 1 month out of 2015, 1 month out of 2016, and 1 month out of 2017.
That's correct.
So this is a reflection of just a sampling of 3 months out of 36 months.
That's correct.
And so from those 3 months, you were able to make a recommendation, and the Port Now administration has decided to follow the recommendations to some extent.
Yes, as far as we can tell from the documentation that they're sending us, without going into any more depth, which would take quite a long time to start, going into making phone calls and going into those statements in a lot more depth, and I'd have to have approval to do that from the committee if they would want to, delve that deeply into the credit card statements. Is there something wrong? Okay, all right, Ms. Toops. Tell me if there is, if there's a fire or something.
No,
but I do think that based on the information that I gathered from those 3 months, I think we're in pretty good shape now. I'm not saying that there couldn't be, some irregularities. I based my finding on the notes that were on the statements itself.
So look at that. Obviously, they're not going to note that it was a person who used
No, sir, they're not going to note that anymore. But I'm not going to accuse anybody of anything.
Right, I understand. But it would be wise not to note that for their benefit.
That's correct.
Any further questions on this audit report from Mr. Duke? All right, Mr. Duke, thank you for your work, and I'm happy to see that we're making some progress in this area. So at this time, if there's no other comments on item A, we'll move to item B.
Correction of the March Audit Committee committee minutes concerning Act 605, safe drinking water. Customers are charged $3 per connection 4 times a year.
And Mr. Duke?
So I want to make a correction to the March Audit Committee meetings minutes concerning Act 605, safe drinking water. As Council Member Ms. Newberry pointed out to me and to the Water Department during the March meeting, customers are charged $3 per connection 4 times a year, and we thank you for that, Ms. Newberry.
Is there any way we can put that as a monthly, just so people who are on a budget? Or
I don't really make that policy, though, but the Water Department, possibly we could put it to the Water Department to see if they could do that.
What's that $3 cover?
Oh, goodness. Connections, per connection.
It's a Safe Water Act.
It's a Safe Water Act.
State fee that is mandated by state that we have to charge.
Per connection.
Fails to test it every quarter. So what do you?
It could start, yeah, well, that's the truth. Yeah.
The money goes to the state. So,
yeah, the money goes to the state, that's right.
the money goes to the state, so they can come down here and
That's a
sample
good
you
point.
and tell you that it's safe.
Get the printout.
The state made the act.
Yet to pass.
I drink it.
Well, any further discussion? We thank you, Ms. Newberry, for pointing that out, and Mr. Duke for correcting the record. Any further discussion on item B? Hearing none, we'll move to item C.
Consideration to add an audit of the Recreation Department to the audit plan is proposed by Councilmember Black.
Yes, Mr. Duke, you want to elaborate on how this came about?
Mr. Black would like to include the Recreation Department on the current audit plan.
Okay. And I personally, I don't have a problem with adding it to, the bottom of the list as we get to it.
Okay.
But I'd like some clarity as to what we're really going to audit, because the Recreation Department doesn't really have a lot of funding other than, collecting for uniforms and all. Now, we could probably audit that. What about the booster clubs? Is he interested in auditing the booster clubs who functioned and raised money on the public
fields?
fields?
Booster clubs would be an important aspect of it, because I've had issues with booster clubs before. However, normally in this situation, what I do is probably audit the accuracy of the financial information, audit the compliance with any type of rules, regulations, maybe look at the efficiency and effectiveness of the operations, safeguarding assets, that sort of thing. But I also try to get with Mr. Black and try to understand where he's going with this audit as well.
The booster club's out, huh? Isn't he going to bids for somebody to run the concession stands?
Well, moving forward, he might be, but we'll be looking in the rearview mirror, auditing past practices, evidently.
Right. Normally, when I've looked at those booster clubs, they're all cash, collections of cash, which is a risk. It's always a high risk. Okay.
Well, we'll consider this, add this to the plan, and I guess if we just add it to the plan, then you can take it upon yourself when you get to it as to what the universe is that you're going to be looking at.
Right. Mr. Black also mentioned to me that he would like for me to do another risk assessment on the entire universe of Plaquemines Parish, which I was planning on doing towards the end of this year. I wanted to get as many audits done from this risk assessment that I did in 2017 and 18. I wanted to try to finish up as many audits as I could and then try to do another risk assessment towards the end of this year for 2020 and 2021. And that's what I did mention to him during our meeting together.
Okay. Well, he hadn't approached the committee, so
Okay.
the committee is made aware of it and take it under advisement, and we'll move from there. Any further discussion on item C? None? Okay, we can move to item 3, old business.
Completed audit, follow-up internal audit of civil service, audits in progress. Number 1, internal audit of the grant process.
Mr. Duke?
Yeah, we had, Mr. Russell and I had discussed the grant process audit that's underway right now. And I hadn't received the population for this until just recently from All South, I believe All South Engineering, who handles the FEMA PWs. And if we take a look at what they sent me, I mean, this is tremendous population. Starting with the Katrina projects, the Gustav projects, the Ike projects, Isaac projects. It is a huge job, and I did this when I was at the court, the Supreme Court. They had me do it in 2017 to take a look at all their PWs, and it took me almost a year to complete that audit. So I guess my question to the committee is really, how. In order for me to give the committee and to provide some good assurance, I think I'd have to do possibly 6 months of looking at this, at least to give you minor assurance. But to give you really good assurance, it would take a year to go over these PWs thoroughly. And I'd like to have some input, I guess, from the committee. Do y'all want that, or do y'all want just a preliminary type of review on this?
Copy of these?
Excuse me, sir?
I get a copy of these.
Yes, I will send you a copy of these.
Because I know right now they dredging the Venice Boat Harbor, and they already needing more money to move boats. And I thought that was in the FEMA funds already.
Well, I think what the documents provided by All South reflect are strictly PWs with the amount that was obligated. And I think the better question would be how many of these PWs are closed and closed out? Because, for instance, in the project that he's mentioning, if they're looking for additional funding to move boats, they will probably go back to FEMA and ask FEMA for additional funds for that PW, and the PW will not be closed out until the project is complete. Now, I don't know if that's a necessary thing in our discussion. You said that it could be an open PW. You could still look at the process and see if it's adequate. But the concerns that have been expressed to me by other members of not just the committee but of the council in whole was that they had seen that there was a PW written for a project maybe in the southern end of the parish, and that project didn't get built because that money was moved to an improved project or an alternate project in some other location of the parish. And so that's where it really gets complicated, because when you move money from a PW at one project, you lose probably 25% of that funding because it goes to an alternate project. And if you put funding from 2 or 3 alternate projects together, then you might lose 25 here, 25 here, 25 here. That's something that I'm not clear on. And I would hope that, we do spend some time to get a feel for what's going on, because just the consultant alone, one of the PWs has covered almost $50 million, and just the consultants managing of this project.
Right.
And there are hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone through these PWs into the parish that, whether it be this building or some other building, there's a ton of money that went through there. And I would hope that at the end of the day, when the federal government or whoever audits FEMA money comes down and sits in Plaquemines Parish for a year or two, that everything has been done properly and we're not on the hook for millions of dollars, that the state is going to say, Plaquemines, we've got a bill here for these items, now you owe us, and then we'll be fighting with the state because the state's going to be on the hook for it. and they're going to come after us if it's not done properly.
Correct, and that's my major concern. You know, where did the money go? You know, and to follow the money and make sure that it went to the proper intended beneficiaries. And in order to do that, I think that I would have to do the same thing that I did at the court, to take a very large sample and spend a lot of time in order to give you all that assurance. That's just my opinion from what I've done in the past. I don't think I can provide adequate assurance by just spending 2 months, which is basically what I've been doing, 2 months per auditable activity. This is an auditable activity that the risk is so high that you really, maybe you'll need to hire somebody specifically to come in here and just do this for a year or two to look after your interests. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I can do this, but it will take me to provide you, and for me to feel good about it, it would take me a while to do the PWs and to really look into this.
I would definitely like to see some relief coming from what we spend at Al South. If we can get some project managers in the parish to save us some money on these projects and make sure they're done right. So I'd like to see what we can do to make this more efficient for the parish.
Yes, ma'am.
So,
To me, they keep dragging it out because they're getting paid more money.
Yes.
I asked them about the Bootville Civic Center. The engineer said I could build it on the ground. They telling me I can't, so.
Once vendors start collecting money, it's very difficult to stop them, especially in this situation, because the only oversight that All South has is themselves, right?
Yep. But on the grant process, the grant for the four-wheeler parking across from the fort, that money's gone.
Well, what I suggest, and we were supposed to have this with GOSEP some time ago. In the last meeting, you know, GOSEP came and gave us an emergency preparedness meeting and updated us on that, but they had agreed to come back and get specifically in detail with PWs and where we stand with the state on outstanding PWs and on reimbursements of existing PWs that are closed and open. And I would suggest before we go in the direction that we have this meeting with GOSEP, and that you know, I'll be glad to call them and remind them of the offer that we had in the last meeting. I believe y'all were in that meeting at the Emergency Operations Center.
Yeah.
And they had agreed to come and meet with us. I think we have to follow through on that meeting and dig down a little bit to see where we're at, so we can get answers to questions like he just raised.
Right.
You know, he would like to know where that PW money went.
Yes.
Because it was a project in his district, and now the money he's being told money is not there anymore. So obviously it was moved, or something happened to it to go to another project. So
right, and it's very difficult for council members when somebody like GOSAP comes in and gives a presentation to you guys, and you all don't know the details about what's going on behind the scenes. It's very difficult for you to make a valid decision. Another thing, too, is I think GOSEP, if they haven't already done it, needs to sign some sort of affidavit stating, you know, that they are responsible for all of these PWs, the integrity and accuracy of the information, that the money is going to the proper beneficiaries, they're in compliance with all rules, regulations. Sign off on, have them sign something on that, just in case what you're saying, Mr. Rousseau, comes about and the state comes in and they try to shirk the responsibility over to the council and to Blackham's Parish. At least we'll have something in writing that says, hey, look, you guys, you all had this responsibility, and you've written down that you are responsible for it. Anything that bad happens, you're responsible for it.
well, I think we should proceed on having a meeting with them, as I mentioned, and we'll go from there. And as far as you looking at the universe, I guess we should discuss that a little bit further among ourselves and kind of figure out where we're headed
Give me some direction on that. I appreciate it. I could go ahead and start a grant audit on the Plaquemines Parish administration portion of the grants, which is not excluding PWs. I can start working on that. And then if you all decide you want me to delve into the PWs, just let me know and I'll do exactly what you want me to do.
Okay, so you came across this in your gathering the universe of grants, and that's how we're here discussing this today?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't get the information from the administration until just a couple of days ago. So I didn't have it for the previous meeting.
Okay. All right, so we know what our tasks are for the next meeting. Any further discussion on item 3A1? There none, we can move to B.
Completed audit, follow-up internal audit of civil service discussion during the May meeting.
Yeah, I have completed the civil service follow-up audit, and I will discuss that during the May meeting.
Okay. Any further discussions on any items on the agenda today? Mr. Colligan?
Yes, I'd like to
Speak on the mic.
yes,
Oh, wait.
Hold on.
Wait. You got him?
Okay.
I'd like to address you, Mr. Roussel, and Mr. Duke on this question in regards to the state legislative audit procedure. How many years goes by before the audit is done in a certain parish?
I'm not sure. Mr. Duke can answer this question, but my understanding is that each entity is responsible for an annual audit.
That's correct. Yeah, the way that
He's talking to the mic, please.
the way that works is that currently Plaquemines Parish is submitting their external audit to the legislative auditors for review. The legislative auditors reviews that audit and signs off on it if they're okay with what their review. If they're okay with their review, they normally don't. They have told me in the past they just don't have the manpower to go around and audit everybody in Louisiana. So they use that mechanism to oversee other entities like Plaquemines Parish.
So what happens is just that he stated, the legislative auditor's manpower in office is not extensive enough to do all required audits under the law. So they are approving auditing firms, such as the one that audits Plaquemines Parish. They have approval from the legislative auditor's office. They are approved to do an audit. They audit. It's up to the local government to hire someone who is approved by the legislative auditor's office to do that annual audit, and they pay, and the government pays them. And so we've been having the same auditing firm here for years, which I believe, and personally, that we should rotate them every 3 years. Now, the finance department would not agree with that because they get friendly with the auditors and they believe that, you know, it's easier for them to audit and so forth. But I believe a fresh set of eyes every 3 years is appropriate.
So are you saying that the Plaquemines Parish is getting audited every year?
Yes, they are.
Okay. The last legislative audit from the state came in 2009.
Well, when the legislative auditor comes down themselves, that's a different story, basically. It complies with the law, but on a normal, and Mr. Duke, you can chime in on this.
Yeah, normally the LLA will come to Plaquemines Parish if they see something that is a concern to them, like fraud, you know, theft, irregularity. They'll come and they'll focus in that particular area. But normally they will not come in and do a financial audit of Plaquemines Parish every year. They just don't do that. Now, some entities they do that with for some reason, like the Supreme Court. When I was working for them, the LLA did come in every single year but they did a financial audit. They didn't do a fraud audit or a theft audit, a financial audit similar to what the external auditors do here every year. And the legislature in Baton Rouge has given the LLA, since they don't have a whole lot of staff and manpower, the permission to use the external audits report to oversee what's going on in this parish and other parishes as well.
Well, in item 2, when you were discussing that, one of the main items stated in that legislative audit was about the use of FEMA money and reporting it, if I'm not mistaken, in lieu of receiving it. Or, you know, they're saying they already have it, but they don't. It hasn't been collected yet from the government.
And I think that's a huge risk, what you're saying. It's a huge risk. And that's what I've been telling the committee here, is that we need to make sure the money's accounted for and it's going to the right beneficiaries. In order for me, by myself, to do that, I would have to spend a year at least going through those FEMA contracts and to feel comfortable with reporting back to the committee on my findings.
I'm sure Mr. Russo still has that document in hand.
I do, but I believe the result of that legislative appearance, state legislative auditor appearance here was because of the way that the parish was running their FEMA PWs in their books. And, you know, you've heard this many times by many people that the parish was basically keeping two sets of books.
Yes.
And that was because some people view that as being FEMA money over here and the parish operating over here, and that money not flowing through the budget. And that's why we're in the quandary that we're in now about, is there enough money for this project? Well, to get that answer, you have to go to All South and ask them how much money is left in the PW, and you got to get the information from them. You can't go to our finance department and ask them, you know, do you know what is in this PW or what this is expenditures are? They don't have that. They'll tell you have to go to All South. And so Plaquemines Parish was highlighted as a prime example several years ago that this is the way not to keep your books. In a function that was held in Algiers, a 3-day state legislative auditor workshop. And unfortunately, the clerk of court was in there, I was in there, several other people from parish were in there. And it was a little embarrassing for them to point us out. And I had to stand up and say, look, I was not the president at the time, and everybody thought it was a joke that I had to say that, but it was real. And so I think that's why you see that 2009 audit, because the state legislative auditor, the council members at the time went to Baton Rouge and enlisted that legislative auditor's office to come down here and try to straighten up what they felt was not proper. And I think that's why that audit was stunned. As Mr. Duke said, they come down and look if they really see a problem.
Was there another audit that around the same time by Homeland Security?
I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that.
In regards to the alternative projects that y'all spoke about earlier, 2013, I think I gave Mr. Kognovich a sample of that showed about $5.7 million going from down the road up here to the building of this.
Right. Well, like I said earlier, I think that it's important that we have this meeting that I mentioned a minute ago to try to get a clearer picture about alternate projects. And one of the issues that I would really like to see is that the local government years ago appropriated in excess of $20 million for NFIP reductions. Now, the NFIP reductions that were taken has never been clear to me as to where that money went. And, you know, when hard times came, I tried to ask several people about, well, maybe there's some money left in that $22 million, I believe, that we appropriated, that we might be able to go back in and take and help supplement the funds, the general fund and so forth, to get us out of the hole. But the accountant of that $22 million, or I think it's $22 million, that was appropriated, I don't have a clear understanding in my mind as to what those NFIP reductions were. And so that's another question that I think GOSEP should be able to answer, and All South should answer it. But in the past, when I have gotten reports from All South, those figures change somewhat from report to report. And what really put me on alert was that when I looked at a report initially given to me when I was not in office years ago, the Oakville Playground had a $1 million NFIP reduction, which wasn't correct, couldn't have been correct. There never was a PW written for $1 million for the Oakville Playground to start with. So that got me thinking about what is really going on with this NFIP reduction. So without belaboring the point, I think that we need to have this meeting. I think the questions need to be brought up to GOSEP like Mr. Konovich said, what happened to this money that was earmarked for this project and so forth. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the best I can give to you right now.
Well, the reason my questions on the legislative audit came because of meetings we've had with some other people involved in these audits or know about the audits, and they told us some years back they weren't doing legislative audits in Plaquemines Parish anymore because there was a congressional block on it. So that kind of disturbed me, and anybody else that heard those comments.
Well, let me say this, though. What happened was, I think what you're referring to is that when the OIG or somebody from Washington was coming down to review the PWs and the FEMA money, I think what happened one time was the oil spill happened, so they postponed it. Another time they had a Hurricane Gustavo Ike, and they postponed it. The third time, I was told also, was it was a congressional request to hold off and give the parish more time. I was told that myself at one time. But that brings us to where we're at today, discussing what our liabilities might be, because we need to make sure that all what went down doesn't come back to haunt us in a few years.
I'm in full agreement with you, and I don't know if Mr. Duke is on board with it, but I agree that it's time to change auditors.
Absolutely.
It's too much.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Too much going on over a period of time.
Yeah, and I have mentioned that on several occasions to Mr. Roussel, so I'm in full agreement with both of you on that.
Well, let me just say
and
this.
preferably nobody from close to the New Orleans area.
This area has been discussed with previous administrations. The council, prior to us being here, wanted to change auditors, and they had a big blow-up and discussion about the administration appoints the auditors. Now, you know, they had the discussion about internal auditor, which is us, and external auditor, which is an outside hiring firm. And the parish president at the time won the battle, saying that he was responsible for hiring the auditor. Now, that's a little precarious because the person that they are hiring, or the firm that they are hiring, is auditing himself. Now, you know, I think that that's not proper. I think that if you really read a good reading of the charter, the Internal Auditing Committee is responsible for all auditing functions.
What it says.
It says that, but an interpretation has been made in the past that doesn't allow this audit committee to hire or even interview auditing firms to do the audit, which I think that one day should be changed, but that's where we're at.
Yeah, I was present at those meetings when that went down.
Okay.
But it was quite a battle.
So
Thank you.
Any other discussion on this item? Hearing none. We thank you all for your comments and attendance today. We'll move to item 4.
Approval of the minutes from the March 14, 2019 meeting.
I have a motion to adopt the minutes.
Off.
Up by Mr. Konovich, seconded by Ms. Newberry. Any comments or discussion on the adoption of the March the 14, 2019 meeting minutes? Hearing none. Machine is open. And the minutes are adopted 3-0. Any further business to come before the committee today? Hearing none. Entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion to adjourn by Mr. Konovich, second by Ms. Newberry. Machine is open. And the meeting is adjourned at 9:48 a.m. Thank you all for your attendance.